sons and daughters, and those sons and daughters became a lot tighter with Noah and the flood, Noah and his sons. And as we saw in Genesis 10, there was a splitting up of people as far as division of groups under Noah's children was concerned. And then after that, what we'll actually see is at the Tower of Babel, what does God do? God confounds the languages. He confuses them with the languages, and they all have to get to their different groups and find people that speak the same language, and then they start going their separate ways. From Babel, they spread out. So that's how we get the different people groups and the different cultures. Now, if this assumption is true, then there should be evidence for it today. If this assumption that all the world came from this bottled up group of people, then we should be able to see it in humanity. I'm going to go ahead and go to this next slide, and I know that it's going to be a lot to look at, and you probably can't even see the details for it, but what this is basically showing is the family tree. It's showing us from Noah, the spreading out to Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and it shows them spreading out into different groups. You could see from Shem's, it goes over to different places and goes into even to Christ, and then Japheth has his own group, and Ham has his own group. What are we saying here? Well, trying to make it clear, if we look through all of what Genesis 10 said, that the generations of humanity in this time are all split up from these three individuals. That's a major assumption to take. And it makes us question, well, if they were all able to speak in that language, and this question, of course, is addressed, right? Then how did we get so many languages? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. But the first answer, of course, is that it came from the Tower of Babel. Another question is, hold on, it's me. Test. Okay, so now the question is, with regards to this story, did the Tower of Babel actually exist? This next slide I'm going to show you may be more for someone who is interested in archaeology and interested in history. We have the Tower of Babel stele, which is basically a ancient text that's part of an early document that's related to Did we get this slide up here? This is the Tower of Babel stele. I think what it's showing here basically is some reference to the history of the Tower of Babel, whether or not it existed. It shows a little bit of credence to the things that we had. And this is something that really makes me laugh a lot of times. In relation to history, there are so many historians down from the early times to today. I would say probably 1800s, 1900s to today. There have been so many people who have questioned the truth of the Bible, so much to the point where they would say things like the Hittites never existed, or King Belteshazzar in Babylon never existed. And these things, time and time again, when you look at the evidence, this is why one of the things that I'm trying to put out in this class is that you shouldn't look just as evidence and say, well, this disproves what I believe and just be done with it, right? Because there are points that seem to be true, right, from evidence, saying like Belteshazzar never existed, or that the Hittites never existed. And you could say, oh man, I have no answer for that. What's more important is having the foundation and understanding that some of this evidence can be disproved. Evidence is not always set in stone. Why? Because later on, we find out Belteshazzar existed. There's proof for it, archaeological proof for it too, and we find out later too that the Hittites existed. There is something probably even today that people are saying this group never existed, this part from the Bible is not true, that will later be proven to be true. You know what's another funny thing too? Is the field of archaeology now, I believe the majority of it is actually done from Christian groups. That's a little strange, right? Why is that? It's because more and more proof has been coming out in favor of Christianity than the opposite. So who do you think are the groups that want to go out there and search up the archaeology? Christian groups. So here we see an ancient text that are part of known documents. This is something that is referring back to the Tower of Babel. And you may wonder what exactly is the Tower of Babel? And is there something that we can see in our time right now, or even in archaeology, that kind of points to the possibility of the Tower of Babel? I'm going to go ahead and go to this next slide here, ziggurats. These are the structures that would be very similar to the Tower of Babel. They're like pyramids, stepped pyramids. And we can see that even in a time with the Tower of Babel, there's already these structures that are being built up. These are already this evidence that there is something like the Tower of Babel around that time or after that time. But what it allows us to see here, whether it be by the archaeology, the Tower of Steel, the Tower of Babel steel, or whether it be the ziggurats, kind of pointing back to it, is that there is a reality that fits in with the truth that the Tower of Babel existed, that the Tower of Babel is a real event. Now, here's the next question that comes out of the Tower of Babel. When we ask that question, right, if everybody was one language and all of these different people groups started to spread out of it, then the question is, did all 7,000 languages come out of Babel? You can see the different languages, right? We can see the different words and asking ourselves the question, but if there's such a small people group, when we looked at I'm not going to go back to it, but when we look back to that tree, right, we saw not that many different people, right? If we can have actually groups, it would be a lot less than that, than the 7,000. So is there a possibility to explain our 7,000 languages that come out of Babel? So I want to put this quotation up next. It is estimated that there are about 6,900 spoken languages in the world. So people ask, were there even that many people at Babel? So what do we point to when we look at those different languages? Did all of these languages form immediately at the Tower of Babel? Well, let's go ahead and go to this next slide. At least 78 families came out of Babel with a new language. So this is a lot fewer than 7,000. This excludes Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and Peleg, descendants of Peleg, who was presumably rather young at this time, such as Abraham, were Hebrews and spoke Hebrew. So now the question, of course, goes back. If there's only 78 different families, at least 78 different families, so let's give a moderate or a liberal estimate and say that there's about 100 different families at this time. That still doesn't account for the 7,000 languages that we have today. Well, let's actually take a step back and think about languages in general. How many of you have been out to the South? I know Pastor was out in Texas recently, right? And some of you may go out there, and how many of you ever heard somebody say, what does the word pop mean in the East Coast? Soda, right? What about Coke here, right? A lot of people say the same thing, soda pop, soda, Coke. There's other things that Coke actually means too, cola, right? And even just the way that people greet each other, right? In one place it could be hello, it could be howdy, it could be hey, it could be what's up. There's a lot of different ways that people greet each other. And if you've even been out to, say, Texas versus California, you would know there's a very different attitude and culture that's out there. Even if you go into the Philippines, right? There are a lot of different languages. There are a lot of variants within the English language. That's the next slide here. And if you can see this, this is Matthew 6:9, which starts off, "Our Father who art in heaven," or "Our Father who is in heaven." This is the Old English Matthew 6:9. And then we could see it breaks down to KJV in 16:11, "Our Father which art in heaven," but it has a U instead. And then Middle English, which looks like it reads, "Our Father that art in Hionis," right? But it's basically the same thing. And then at the very bottom, you could see how different Old English is from even late modern English, or how Old English is from early modern English, or how Old English is different from how we speak today. Very different. Within English as one language, there's a lot of variants that have come over 700 years. So that in and of itself can account for some of the language changes. And like I said before, even something regionally. If you go into Louisiana, if you go into Canada, if you go into California or Oregon, you're going to find that different people speak the same language, but it sounds very different. Go ahead and go to the next slide. According to Ethnologue and Vista-Wide World Languages, who both do linguistic studies, this kind of goes closer to what we saw before, they claim there are 95 to 100 language families. So what does this tell me as somebody that's looking at it from a biblical worldview, from a biblical perspective? It tells me that this actually does line up together with our assumption that at the Tower of Babel, there are about 78 families that spread up with the different languages. It actually kind of holds true. And in this next slide here, we can see that our belief is this, that from the Tower of Babel, the one race, one human race, split off into their different places. They went out into their different countries, their different cities, as far east as China and Russia, as far west as even going over to, at that time, of course, into Spain and into Great Britain. And then even going further out east, ended up going west, we come into North America and into South America. So now our question is, how did this world, how was it able to get all of these different people to come to these different places? The question that comes up next, as you see in this slide, what means did they travel? By what means did they travel? How did they get to their different places? Were they able to establish their new families? How were they able to get into, come into so many different nations and to actually come to what we see today? Let's go ahead and go back to Genesis. What does the Bible say? Genesis 10:5 says, "By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, and their families in their nations." So, how did they travel? The isles of the Gentiles. The thought here is that a lot of them were able to go through the islands, through boat. And one of the things that we do also agree with is that this splitting off of people allows them to even walk over, and we'll talk about it in a second, over ice. So Christians and atheists both believe in an ice age, or a time where there is ice. However, the length that we see it and the reason for why we see the earth being covered with water or being covered with ice in some areas is very different. I'll talk about that in a second. But let's go ahead and go to this next slide. Another question that we ask ourselves too is, I don't understand why during the Tower of Babel and why further from the flood, we actually get it to where generations start to become shorter and shorter. Why do people live for a shorter amount of time today than they did in their time of the Bible? One of the reasons that we'll see is is because of the change in atmosphere. Some of it is also because they started to worship their ancestors. Because imagine too, you're looking out at the people around you, and you see your ancestor has been around for 300 years, and you see that, and you've only been alive for 100 years even, and your experience is not as much as that person. So there's this tendency to worship, and there's tendency to keep those ancestral lines closer, and genetically too. So there's a lot of reasons for why the time starts to get shorter as far as their lives explained, but I think part of it is actually because of the bottlenecking of the genetics and because of the things that are happening. So now, going back though to the previous question that we asked earlier, how did they travel to different places? How did people get from the other side of the world over to America? Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. This is Mysteries of Ancient Americas, and it shows us a couple different boats that were built during this time, a couple different structures or vehicles that were used to be able to go across into America. Now, of course, we look at this and we say, but there's such a far distance that has to take place in order to get from the Middle East all the way out to America. I'll come back to that in a second. But now the question becomes this. If people from the Middle East and from Africa or from the Tower of Babel, if they spread out and they went into America, then is there a possibility that their languages would actually be similar? That's actually this is actually a result that should happen from the Tower of Babel. So there's a place in Southern America where there is a group of people called, I think, with the name Olmec. And Olmec, the language was looked out there, and they were trying to compare the languages with people in Southern America, all the different American languages, and it wouldn't really match up. So I'm going to go ahead and go to this next slide for Olmec and read this first part. The claim here for Olmec is that they came from the east, specifically from Africa, by an ancient Mayan deity, right? Legendary leader Itzamna. So that's their belief as far as how they came from Africa over into America. So now, because it wasn't matching up with any of the other American languages that had kind of split off from it, then they were having to compare the language of Olmec, and they compared it back to another language in West Africa. And somebody, a linguist, was looking over the language, and he says, oh yeah, I can recognize this. I can actually read this. What does that show us? That their language family was actually similar as opposed to the ones within America. They were more similar to the one in West Africa, in Mende. So what does that actually tell us? It doesn't actually confirm, as a Christian, we shouldn't be like, oh man, maybe the Mayan gods really did bring them over from Africa. No, because of your presupposition, which is that they traveled from Babel, it actually makes more sense for you from that lens, from that worldview. That's how they got there, because they traveled out there from Babel. And that's why the languages are so similar too. It doesn't make sense for us, especially as Christians, to think that a Mayan god transported them from Africa into Southern America. It makes more sense as a believer to understand that they traveled there based off of their ships, going from Middle East, going into the other area. I'm going to go to this next one, ocean currents. Right, this slide here kind of shows you not only could we see from the ocean currents that they could travel there from looking from Russia and from Asia, but going to the next slide here, you could actually see that if we are to understand that there is actually partly an ice age during this time, it would be very easy for them to travel from Russia over into Alaska and go all the way down into South America. So that's what we believe. We believe that a lot of this, because of the ice age, created, on this next slide, land bridges. So that's how they were able to get there. What am I saying? Now, this is a pretty dense lesson as far as all the content that's getting out to you. But what I'm saying is this, is that when you look at core truths in the Bible, whether it be the flood, or Babel, or young earth, or archaeology, what we see is the world is going to try to use evidence against us, but if we look hard at the evidence that is presented, we can actually use our presuppositions to confirm our beliefs based off of the evidence. Looking here, right, again, everything we learned from the Tower of Babel, we've actually understood more and more, confirming to us that the Tower of Babel was real, confirming to us that these different generations were able to split out. What I'm saying is, especially as, and this is an older class as far as individuals are concerned, but it's still just as important as if I were talking to young people. Don't get thrown off just because somebody knows more than you about a topic. Stick with where you are, stick with your core beliefs, and agree, even if you may know more than me about this topic, I'm going to go back into the scriptures, I'm going to go back into the truths and try to search out for myself. I'm not going to give in to you, though, either. Not right away, and not ever, too. Your mindset should be, if something seems like it is attacking and is a threat to my Christianity and to my faith, my goal should be to fight back, not literally, but to fight back by learning more from the scriptures, by learning more from what's around us. So now, I'm going to go through a couple more things, but the next question is, where did the people initially go? And there's a lot of material here, but all the things that I'm pointing out to you come from these different sources. So the criteria for where they went initially is on the following slide. The criteria would come from biblical passages, and not all biblical passages will give us the exact information about where they went, but the next one is history and historians. So we'll actually get names, maps, etc. Language family. So that will actually help us in understanding, like we saw before, right? With Olmec going from Africa, from East Africa, or from West Africa, from Mende, and them being similarities, we can actually trace that back and forth to which generation and which family group it came from. There's genetic studies that we can see, and then also there's the mythological and oral tradition. So first of all, there is Ham, and there are different groups that came from Ham. There's Mizraim, there's Put, there's Cush, and there's Canaan. So this is from Ham. We have the first family that is Cush, and on that next slide you could see him going out to these different areas. I'm going to try to move through these slides quickly, but you can kind of see the area that Ham went into. So there's Cush going into Africa, into northern Africa, and then going into India. And then on the next one from Ham, there's also Mizraim, which is this next individual here. I'm going to the same kind of areas, and from Ham, we get some from China and from North Africa too. And then also from Ham, going further into the western part of Africa is Put. From there, we get the Olmecs. That's the one that we were talking about before. Possibly with the Olmecs, they traveled partly by land during the, like we said, the ice bridges and the land bridges that were created, and then also partly by ship going out into America. So let's go to that last slide too. Ham, it makes up of Mizraim, Put, and Cush. And then lastly too is Canaan. So from Canaan, of course, we see them go into Israel's area, and then even going all the way out into the Orient and China. So next, we have Japheth. Where does Japheth go? He has Gomer, Magog, Madai, Havan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. His first one, Japheth, Gomer and his son Riphath. From this generation, we get a lot of the European areas, Galatia, which is Spain, and there are two different ones. There's one Galatia that's a little bit further inland, and I think that is in Europe, further inland and Eastern Europe, and then there's a Galatia on the west, which is Spain, and then you could even see them going out into Germany, France, and into Great Britain and Ireland. So we get the Europeans that come from Japheth. The next one too is similar in this one is Gomer or Ashkenaz. So from this group too, the Ashkenaz, if you've ever heard of the Ashkenazi Jews too, that's similar from this area right here that you'll get. Still kind of more inland Europe and into Denmark even too. And then from Japheth, Gomer and Togarmah, we go into the Istans area, whether it be Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and then also even into, I think, Russia in these areas too. And then also, this is the one, from Magog, which is the next one, going into Russia and into the Slavic areas. So you can see the similarities that we actually have within these different people groups of the families. The smaller groups of families will actually see a lot of similarities with these type of people. The Slavs and the Russians, very similar in their culture, in the way that in their appearances. You could see that they are distant relatives, even when you look out into different groups as well. And then Japheth also, Meshech, which is the next one, going also into Russia. And then the last two, which is Havan and Tubal. Let's go ahead and go to that next one. I think the next slide is duplicated. So the next slide is actually under Shem. Shem is from 5 different groups, which is Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. And for these different groups, we could go ahead and go quickly through this next slide. You see how they go into India, and then the next slide is Shem going into Asher. His group goes into China, and then from Shem on the next one, Arphaxad, which stays kind of local in this area, and even into the Israelite area. And then the next one is Lud and Laud, which goes into Lydia, into Lycians, into the Eastern European area, the lower area, and then this next slide here, which is Abraham. So under the lineage of Abraham, we see, of course, the Israelites. And let's go ahead and give this last slide too. So there's a lot of information here, but what we're trying to show you is that within these different lineages and within these different people groups, we have all of them spreading out into their different areas. And it's a wonderful thing to see because biblically and historically, a lot of this, or not a lot of this, but most of this, if not all of it, right, is either shown or at least matches up. All of it would at least match up to the realities that we see, to the world around us, and to the reality that the Tower of Babel and the origin of the spreading of the peoples makes sense. Now you might ask too, what about Americas and Australia? As I said before, from these groups we have a lot of different land bridges, and the next slide would actually show us how they went out into Australia, how they went out into these different areas. The main one that I told you before, of course, was Russia going into Alaska and then spreading downward into America. I'm going to go ahead and skip over, just for the sake of time, and go to the slide, were there any extra biblical accounts of a language split? So that one's a little bit further down, perfect. And one of the things that is interesting to me in history is that the Bible oftentimes is not the sole proponent of a specific event or a specific story. Like with the Bible, the flood, there's a story of the flood. I I think the name for the most common one outside of the biblical account of the flood is the tale of Gilgamesh. And we actually see a lot of different cultures have the story of the flood and the first family being Noah. In this one too, we can go ahead and go to this next one. There are a lot of different stories, tongue-twisting tales, showing that there's a story where there's a splitting off of the languages. A lot of different people have this same story in their accounts, in their history, in their mythology, you could even say. Even as old as Plato. Let's go ahead and go to this next slide. Plato says, "In the days of the old gods, had the whole earth distributed among them by allotment. There was no quarreling, for you cannot rightly suppose that the gods did not have what was proper for each of them to have, or knowing this, that they would seek to procure for themselves by contention that which more properly belonged to others." Then this next one, Ham Shepherd, talks about a legend of the Maidu Indians of California, says that everybody spoke the same language until during preparations for a special burning ceremony, when suddenly in the night everybody began to speak in a different tongue, except that each husband and wife talked the same language. So even with these different accounts, we see that there's a historicity that comes together with the Tower of Babel. With this group here, there's a group that's saying the same things. What am I saying with this whole lesson? Is that the Tower of Babel is a real event that happened in history. And based off of the information and the truth that we have today, we can link back to that and say there's a lot of evidence that points back to the reality of the Tower of Babel. Now, the last question is this. What do I see, though, as a Christian when I see the Tower of Babel? And in truth, this is what we should see. We should see Christ at the Tower of Babel. Genesis 11, verse 7 says this, "Go to, let us go down." In the Tower of Babel, the Trinity is speaking. Jesus Christ is present at the Tower of Babel. In Genesis 1:26, we see that same kind of language. In the Bible, in the Tower of Babel, too, we see the word and the language. Lord, we see I am with Jesus Christ. How do we know that he's part of the Trinity? Well, Jesus Christ says, "Before Abraham was, I am." And lastly, what do we see with the Tower of Babel? You would think, after God had put all of this effort into getting rid of the people and only sparing Noah, that after Noah's own family did basically the same thing and ended up trying to make themselves do something without the power of God to be able to get to the heavens without the Lord, that at this point God would say, well, you know what? This is already your second strike, and this is one of many strikes, really, that you've had over and over and over again. My punishment for you is to cease existing. You would think that's what God would do. But what does he do instead? He confounds the languages, he confuses them, and splits them off, and lets them be able to still live their own lives. But with a singular purpose in mind, that the next time that the entire world would really be unified would be at his second coming, would be at Christ's coming. God, even in the middle of a time where the world seemed to be against him or was against him, still showed grace. And I think a lot of people right now think about the world that's going on around them, and they think to themselves, God should not show grace on these people. But you know what the truth is? God still gives us grace. God still gives our world grace. God still gives the people that we would otherwise hate grace. And our response should be, I need to spread that grace to the people around me. Our response to this lesson should be, first of all, I am a lot closer to my neighbor than I think. And second, because I become stronger in my stance for the Bible, because I believe more in the Tower of Babel and the existence here, because of these truths that I'm starting to have more confirmed in me, instead of splitting me further away from the world as far as reaching out to the world, it should make me stronger in reaching out to the people around me. Let's go ahead and pray. Lord, Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for allowing us to be able to have the Sunday school lesson and talk about the dispersion of Babel. I pray that you would be with each and every one in here as we learn more about the one race and one blood. I pray that it would help us to realize that we are one race, Lord, the human race, and also help us to understand that because of that truth, we should not be afraid to spread the gospel and your message of grace to each and every person around us, Lord. Pray that you please dismiss us now with your blessing. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Right? You may be dismissed.